Theda Collins felt the dawn before she saw it, a cold breath against the sweat on her neck. It carried the scent of dust and judgment. From the sagging porch of the farmhouse that had been hers for 10 years and would be for 10 minutes more, she watched them gather. They came on foot and in wagons, their shapes emerging from the gray mist clinging to the valley floor. They were vultures in homespun and denim, come to pick the bones of her life. Her husband Thomas had left her with 2 strong hands, 1 good mule, and a mountain of debt sealed with a banker's smile. The hands were calloused, the mule was old, and the smile had finally bared its teeth. At the head of the small, murmuring crowd stood Mr. Silas Croft. He was a pillar of the town of redemption, which meant he was the one who held up the roof while owning the floorboards under everyone's feet. His suit was dark, his belly was round, and his face was a mask of polite sympathy that didn't quite reach his small, assessing eyes. He had offered his condolences when Thomas died of the fever, and his regrets when the final notice was served. Now he stood ready to absorb her 30 acres and the Sweetwater spring that bubbled up in the north pasture into his ever-expanding portfolio of other people's misfortune. He wanted that spring. It was the only reason this auction was happening with such swift, brutal efficiency. Theda wrapped her arms around herself, the wool of her shawl worn thin as a memory. She had not slept. She had spent the night walking through the rooms, touching the cool, smooth wood of the table Thomas had built, running her fingers over the chipped rim of her mother's water pitcher. She had stood in the barn and breathed in the scent of hay and horse, her horse, Daisy, who would be sold. She had knelt in the garden, her fingers digging into the dark, rich soil she had nurtured from barren clay. Each touch was a farewell, each scent a ghost. Now there was nothing left to do but watch it all be given away. The auctioneer, a man named Peters whose voice was usually reserved for prize cattle, climbed onto the back of a wagon. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the still morning air. Theda's gaze drifted past him, past the expectant faces, to the far edge of the assembled crowd. A lone rider sat upon a dark, powerful horse, a silhouette against the pale, rising sun. She could not make out his face, but she knew the set of his shoulders. Nate. His Rocking N ranch was the largest in the territory, a sprawling kingdom of grass and cattle that bordered her own small plot. He was a man made of silence and authority, respected and feared in equal measure. He had lost his wife years ago and had sealed himself away from the world, a fortress of a man whose only companions were his work and his grief. What was he doing here? He had no need of her meager belongings. "All right, folks," Peters began, his voice taking on its professional, cajoling rhythm. "We're here today for the property of the late Thomas Collins. A sad day indeed. But life moves on, and so must the land." He gestured to the house, the barn, the fields stretching out behind him. "We'll start with the property as a whole, 30 acres, farmhouse, barn, and all improvements. A good piece of land with the best spring in this county. Who'll start the bidding for me? Who'll say $500? A derisive snort came from somewhere in the crowd. 500 was a joke, but it was the opening move in a game she was destined to lose. Mr. Croft raised a single manicured finger. 300, he said, his voice smooth as butter. He wasn't bidding. He was setting the price of her ruin. Peters, who owed the bank as much as anyone, nodded gratefully. 300 I have from Mr. Croft. A fine start. Do I hear 350? 3 1/4? Anyone? The crowd was silent. They were tenants and neighbors, men who knew the value of this land but also knew the folly of bidding against Silas Croft. They looked at their boots, at the sky, anywhere but at Theda. Their silence was a betrayal, but she understood it. They had their own families to feed, their own debts to manage. 300 going once, Peters chanted, his voice lacking any real enthusiasm. Going twice. He was rushing it. He wanted it over. They all did. $1,000. The voice was low and flat, but it cut through the morning air like a thrown knife. Every head turned. Theda's heart hammered against her ribs. The rider, Nate, had urged his horse a few steps forward. The sun was behind him, turning him into a dark, imposing figure. He hadn't shouted, but his words held more weight than any yell. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Mr. Croft's face, which had been a picture of smug satisfaction, hardened. A flush crept up his thick neck. He stared at Nate, his eyes narrowed. "What is this, Nate?" he called out. "You have no need of this little plot." Nate ignored him, his gaze fixed on the auctioneer. Peters looked like a man who had just been handed a live snake. I have a bid of $1,000 from Mr. Nate," he stammered. Croft's jaw tightened. He had expected to steal this land. Now he was being forced to buy it. 1,100, he snapped. 2,000, Nate said immediately, his voice as calm and unhurried as before. He did not look at Croft. He did not look at anyone. He just sat on his horse, a man carved from the granite of the mountains behind him. The crowd began to murmur, the sound like wind stirring dry leaves. This was no longer an auction, it was a duel. A contest of wills between the two most powerful men in the valley. Theda felt a strange, dizzying flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. It was a terrifying, painful sensation. 2,100, Croft bid out, his face now a mottled red. 3,000, Nate countered, the words falling like stones into a still pond. He hadn't moved. His hands rested easy on his saddle horn. He looked as if he were commenting on the weather. Theda watched, breathless. She didn't understand. Nate barely knew her. They had exchanged perhaps a dozen words in the years they had been neighbors. Polite nods at the general store, a gruff ma'am if he passed her on the road. Why was he doing this? This wasn't business. This was a statement. He was driving the price up to a place of absurdity for 30 acres of land, no matter how good the spring was. Croft was practically vibrating with fury. He was a man used to getting his way, to people folding before his power. Nate was not folding. He was not even bending. 3,500, Croft shouted, his voice cracking. 5,000, Nate said. The words hung in the air, absolute and final. A dead silence fell over the yard. $5,000. It was an astronomical sum, more than the farm was worth twice over. It was the price of a small ranch, not a widow's homestead. Croft stared at Nate, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. He had been beaten. Not just beaten, but publicly and soundly humiliated. He had been made to look small, his greed exposed for all to see. He spun on his heel, shoving his way through the stunned onlookers and stomping toward his buggy without another word. Peters, his face pale, wiped his brow with a handkerchief. $5,000, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Sold to Mr. Nate. Nate swung down from his horse, the movement fluid and economical. The jingle of his spurs on the hard-packed earth was the only sound. He walked not to the auctioneer, but directly to the wagon where Mr. Croft's clerk sat with the paperwork, his face a mixture of fear and awe. Nate signed the deed of sale, his movements precise. He didn't haggle or discuss. He simply took the papers, folded them once, and walked toward the porch where Theda stood, frozen. She felt like a statue, unable to move or speak as he approached. He was taller up close than she remembered, his shoulders broad under his worn leather vest. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and a deep, abiding sorrow. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers. There was no warmth in them, no pity. There was nothing she could name. He stopped at the bottom step, the worn wood groaning under his weight. He held out the folded papers. "This is yours," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of emotion. Theda stared at the deed, then back at his face. Her mind struggled to catch up. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I can't pay you for this." "I'm not asking you to," he said. He pressed the papers into her unresisting hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt the calloused warmth of his skin. The touch was like a spark on dry tinder, a sudden, shocking jolt of life. "The land is yours. The house. Everything. Croft won't bother you again." He turned without another word and walked back to his horse. He swung into the saddle, his back straight, and rode away, disappearing into the morning light as quietly as he had appeared. Theda was left standing on her porch, the deed to her own life clutched in her hand, the murmuring of the dispersing crowd a distant, meaningless buzz. She looked down at the papers, at the bold, decisive signature. Nate. He hadn't just outbid every man there. He had bought her a future she thought was gone forever, and she had no idea why. The days that followed were stranger than the auction itself. Nate's dramatic intervention had saved her from destitution, but it had also painted a target on her back. The town of redemption, which had been prepared to pity her, did not know what to do with her now. She was a curiosity, a scandal in the making. The whispers followed her like her own shadow when she went to the general store for flour and salt. Was she his charity case? Or something less respectable? The women of the town, led by Mr. Croft's wife, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, looked through her as if she were glass. The men looked at her with a new, calculating interest. She was Nate's property now, in their eyes, and it made her both untouchable and endlessly fascinating. Theda ignored them. She had work to do. She was no one's property. The land was hers in name, but she felt the weight of Nate's $5,000 like a physical burden. It was a debt she could never repay in coin, so she would repay it in labor. She would make this farm thrive in a way that would honor the impossible price he had paid. She rose before the sun, just as she always had, and worked until her muscles screamed and her back ached with a satisfying fire. She mended the fences Croft had let fall into disrepair, cleared the overgrown pasture, and turned the soil in her garden with a ferocity born of gratitude and pride. She saw nothing of Nate. His vast ranch was a silent neighbor. Sometimes, from the high point of her north pasture, she could see his men moving like ants in the distance, driving cattle, but the man himself remained a mystery. He had given her back her world and then vanished from it. A part of her was relieved. His presence was unsettling, a complication she didn't know how to navigate. Another, quieter part of her felt a pang of disappointment. She wanted to understand the man who had acted with such inexplicable, decisive force. One afternoon, about a week after the auction, she was weeding her vegetable patch when she heard a commotion from the direction of the rocking N. It was the sound of splintering wood, followed by a man's sharp cry of pain and the furious, terrified scream of a horse. Her head snapped up. She ran to the fence line that separated her land from his, her heart pounding. In a large corral not 50 yards away, a magnificent black stallion was bucking and rearing, a whirlwind of panicked muscle and flashing hooves. 2 ranch hands were scrambling out of the enclosure, one of them clutching a bleeding arm. The horse was a demon, its eyes rolling white, foam flying from its mouth. It was the most beautiful and terrifying animal Theda had ever seen. And then she saw Nate. He stood just outside the corral, his arms braced on the top rail, his face a mask of stone. He wasn't looking at his injured man. He was looking only at the horse, and the expression on his face was a complex mixture of frustration, anger, and something that looked painfully like grief. He was watching the horse the way a man might watch a fire consume something he loved. Theda knew about this horse. They called him Diablo. He was Nate's prize, bred from the finest stock, but he was untamable. He had thrown every rider, injured 3 men, and was considered by the ranch hands to be pure poison. Nate, they said, refused to give up on him. He refused to have him broken by force, and he refused to sell him. So the stallion remained, a beautiful, violent prisoner. Without thinking, Theda slipped through the rails of her own fence and walked slowly toward the corral. The injured man was being led away by his friend, who shot her a warning look. "Stay back, ma'am. He's in a foul mood today." She didn't listen. Her eyes were on the stallion. She saw past the violence. She saw the terror that was driving it. This wasn't malice. It was fear so profound it had turned into rage. She rested her hands on the top rail, a few yards down from Nate. He didn't acknowledge her. He might not have even noticed her arrival, so intent was his focus on the horse. "He's afraid," Theda said, her voice soft. Nate's head turned slowly. His eyes, when they met hers, were cold and hard. "He's dangerous," he countered, his voice clipped. "Only because he's afraid," she repeated, not backing down. She turned her attention back to the stallion, which was now trotting in tight, agitated circles, its head high, its nostrils flared. She began to speak to him, her voice a low, soothing murmur. She didn't use words, just sounds. A soft, crooning hum that she had used as a girl to calm frightened birds and stray dogs. It was a sound that came from a place deeper than thought. The stallion's ear twitched. It cocked its head, its frantic circling slowing. It looked at her, its dark, intelligent eyes wide with suspicion and a flicker of curiosity. Nate was silent beside her, but she could feel his stillness, the intensity of his attention. She kept humming, her body relaxed, her presence non-threatening. She was not a conqueror. She was not a master. She was just another creature, offering peace. Slowly, cautiously, she unlatched the gate and slipped inside the corral. Nate made a sharp, involuntary movement. "Don't," he commanded, his voice tight with alarm. Theda held up a hand to him, a gesture asking for trust, for silence. She never took her eyes off the stallion. She didn't walk toward him. She simply stood her ground a few feet inside the gate and continued her soft, rhythmic humming. Diablo snorted, pawed the ground, and took a hesitant step toward her. Then another. He stretched out his long neck, his nostrils flaring as he scented her. He was gathering information, deciding if she was a threat. She smelled of earth and sun and sweat, not of fear or aggression. She stood perfectly still as the massive head came closer, close enough for her to feel the horse's warm breath on her arm. Her heart was a drum against her ribs, but her hands were steady. Slowly, she lifted one hand, palm open and down, and held it out. The stallion flinched but didn't bolt. He watched her hand for a long moment. Then, with an astonishing gentleness, he lowered his head and touched his velvety nose to her palm. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped Nate's lips. It was a ragged, incredulous sound. Theda kept her hand steady, letting the horse investigate her. Then, with the same slow, deliberate calm, she raised her other hand and gently stroked the side of his powerful neck. The muscles under his hide were bunched and hard as rock. But as she stroked, she felt a subtle tremor run through him, a faint, almost imperceptible loosening. She stayed with him for what felt like an hour, though it was likely only a few minutes, simply stroking him and humming her wordless song. The wild terror in his eyes subsided, replaced by a wary but peaceful acceptance. Finally, she backed away slowly, latched the gate behind her, and turned to face Nate. He was staring at her, his face stripped bare of its usual stony mask. In his eyes she saw a raw, unguarded astonishment. He looked from her to the horse, which now stood quietly in the center of the corral, and back again. He had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time. He had seen the quiet, unshakable strength she held within her, a power that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with understanding. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Theta shrugged, a little uncomfortable under the intensity of his gaze. "I just listened to what he was saying," she said simply. "No one else was." Nate didn't reply. He just continued to look at her, a silent, searching gaze that seemed to see right through her skin and into the deepest parts of her. In that moment, the $5,000 felt less like a debt and more like a bridge, an inexplicable connection between his lonely, guarded world and her own. The next morning, as Theta stepped onto her porch with a cup of coffee, she found a large, freshly filled bucket of water by the steps. It was from his well, she knew. The water from her own spring was sweet, but the well water from the rocking N was colder, drawn from deeper in the earth. It was a small, practical gesture, but it felt like a conversation. It was an acknowledgement. An offering? She found a similar bucket there every morning after that. A few days later, Nate appeared at her fence line as she was turning Daisy the mule out to pasture. He didn't ride up to the house. He just waited, his hands resting on the top rail, until she saw him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice as formal as ever. He gestured with his head toward the corral where Diablo stood. "I'd consider it a favor if you'd be willing to work with him. I'll pay you for your time." Theta felt a flush of pleasure, followed by a prickle of defiance. "I don't need your pay, Mr. Nate, but I'll help with the horse." A flicker of something, annoyance, respect, crossed his face. "Nate," he said. "Just Nate." He paused. "I'd be in your debt." And so it began. Every afternoon, she would walk over to the rocking N, and they would work with Diablo together. Or rather, she would work, and he would watch. She taught him not with force, but with patience. She taught him to accept the weight of a saddle blanket, then the saddle itself, not by tying him down and forcing it on him, but by making it a curiosity, a game. She rewarded his calm with a soft word or a gentle scratch. Nate stood by the fence, silent and watchful. He never interfered, never offered advice. He just observed, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. But the silence between them began to change. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the shared task, with the quiet breathing of the horse, with unspoken questions. Sometimes, after she was done, he would walk with her back to her fence line. The first time, they walked the whole way without a single word. The second time, he commented on the weather. The third time, he asked about her garden. "Your tomatoes are coming in strong," he said, his gaze on the neat rows. "They're a good crop this year," she replied, surprised he'd noticed such a thing. My wife, Sarah," he started, and the name hung in the air between them, heavy and unfamiliar. He cleared his throat. She could never get a tomato to grow, said the soil hated her. It was the first time he had ever mentioned her. Theta's heart ached for the sorrow she heard in that one simple sentence. She wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort, but she didn't know how, so she just nodded. "Some hands have the touch for it, some don't," she said softly. It was an inadequate response, but it was all she had. He seemed to accept it. One Saturday, Theta went to the general store for supplies. The moment she walked in, the low hum of conversation ceased. Mrs. Croft was at the counter, her back ramrod straight. She turned, gave Theta a look of pure acid, and said to the storekeeper in a voice that carried through the entire room, I'll take my business elsewhere if you're serving her kind. Theda froze, a bag of beans clutched in her hand. The heat of shame and anger rose in her cheeks. The storekeeper, a timid man named Henderson, wrung his hands, looking terrified. Before he could stammer out a reply, the door opened and the room went even quieter. Nate stood in the doorway, the sun at his back. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance: Mrs. Croft's venomous posture, Henderson's fear, and Theda's pale, defiant face. He walked past Mrs. Croft as if she were a sack of flour, his spurs ringing on the floorboards. He stopped directly in front of Theda. "Theda," he said, and the sound of her first name in his low voice made her look up. "I was just about to ask Henderson his opinion on this new batch of seed oats. I'd value your thoughts on it." He put his hand on the small of her back, a firm, warm pressure that was both a steadying anchor and a bolt of lightning. He guided her toward the counter, placing her directly between him and the rest of the store. He had publicly, unequivocally taken her side. He had built a wall around her with his own body. Mrs. Croft let out a strangled gasp, her face contorted with fury, and swept out of the store, slamming the door behind her. Nate didn't flinch. He calmly discussed the quality of the oats with a still shaking Henderson, all the while keeping his hand gently on Theda's back. He paid for her beans along with his own supplies, and then he walked her out into the sunlight. The touch lingered even after he had removed his hand. "Some people mistake cruelty for strength," he said, his voice quiet as he loaded her sack of beans into her wagon. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He just nodded, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll see you this afternoon," he said, before turning and walking toward his own wagon. As she watched him go, Theda knew something profound had shifted. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her, in a way, in front of the whole town. And she had not felt owned, she had felt seen. The slow burn of their connection deepened in the weeks that followed. He started bringing his daughter, a quiet, solemn 7-year-old named Lily, with him to watch her work with Diablo. The girl had her father's winter sky eyes and a sadness that seemed too heavy for her small frame. She had lost her mother as a baby and was being raised by a stern, joyless housekeeper. Lily watched Theda with a shy, hungry curiosity. One day, Theda brought a small, sweet apple from her own tree. After she finished with Diablo, she walked over to where Lily sat on the fence rail. "This is for you," she said, holding it out. Lily looked at her father. Nate, who had been watching the exchange with his usual guarded expression, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The girl took the apple, her small fingers brushing Theda's. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered. The next day, Lily brought her a wildflower. The day after that, she asked Theda a question about Daisy the mule. A fragile bridge was being built between them, and Theda could see in the way Nate watched them that it was chipping away at the fortress around his heart. He was beginning to see her not just as a capable horsewoman, but as a source of warmth in the cold world he had built for himself and his daughter. The final wall came down during a storm. It blew in from the west without warning, a furious squall of wind and rain that turned the world to a gray blur. Theda was rushing to secure her chicken coop when she saw him riding through the deluge toward her farm. He wasn't heading for the house. He was riding toward the far fence line, the one that bordered the creek. She pulled her shawl over her head and ran out to meet him, the rain plastering her dress to her skin in seconds. He was already off his horse, working in the downpour, his coat soaked through. A large section of the fence had been washed out by the rising creek, and her small herd of cattle was in danger of being swept away. "Go inside," he yelled over the roar of the wind. "I'll handle this." "It's my fence," she yelled back, grabbing a loose post and trying to wedge it back into the muddy bank. He worked beside her, their shoulders bumping, their hands covered in mud. They didn't speak again, just fought against the storm together, a silent, desperate team. When the last post was secured, they were both exhausted, soaked to the bone, and shivering. They took shelter under the scant cover of a large oak tree. The rain dripped from the leaves, running in rivulets down his face. He looked at her, his hair plastered to his forehead, his shirt clinging to the hard muscles of his chest. All the barriers were gone, washed away by the storm. There was no rancher and widow, no debtor and savior. There were only two people standing close enough to feel each other's warmth. "You're a stubborn woman, Theda Collins," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're a meddling man, Nate," she replied, a small smile touching her lips. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and the air between them grew thick and heavy. He leaned in, his hand coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. She saw the raw need in his eyes, the longing he kept so tightly locked away. This was it. The moment the world had been holding its breath for. A crash of lightning split the sky, illuminating his face, and in it she saw a flash of fear. He pulled back as if burned, the spell broken. "The fence will hold," he said, his voice suddenly gruff and distant. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode back into the storm without another glance, leaving her with the ghost of his touch on her skin and the aching, hollow space of what had almost been. Silas Croft was not a man who accepted defeat. Nate's public humiliation of him at the auction had curdled into a poisonous obsession. He had lost the land, but more importantly, he had lost face. Every time he saw Theda Collins in town, her head held high, or heard the whispers about her and the powerful rancher, it was like salt in a wound. He began to dig. A man like Thomas Collins, always chasing a dream and never quite catching it, was bound to have left loose ends. Croft spent his evenings poring over old ledgers and loan agreements in the back room of his bank, the air thick with the smell of stale paper and resentment. And then he found it. A small, secondary loan, taken out a year before Thomas died. It was for a dozen head of cattle, a desperate measure to try and build a herd. The collateral wasn't the land, which was already mortgaged to the hilt. The collateral was the livestock itself, and any future offspring. The loan had been forgotten in the chaos after Thomas's death, and Theda knew nothing of it. It was a legal thread, thin but strong enough to pull. He smiled, a tight, unpleasant stretching of his lips. He would not try to take the land from Nate. That was a fool's errand. He would bleed the woman who lived on it. He would take her means of survival. He would make her a pauper again, this time right under Nate's nose. He would show the whole town that she was nothing but a charity case, propped up by a powerful man's whim, and that when the whim faded, she would fall. A week after the storm, Croft made his move. He arrived at Theda's farm in his polished buggy, but he was not alone. Beside him sat the town sheriff, a man named Beaker, whose loyalty was tied less to the law and more to the generous line of credit he enjoyed at Croft's bank. Two of Croft's hired men followed on horseback. Theda was in the barn, forking hay for Daisy, when she heard the buggy arrive. Her stomach clenched. A visit from Silas Croft was never a social call. She walked out into the bright morning sun, wiping her hands on her apron, her face set in a calm, determined mask. "Mr. Croft, Sheriff," she said, her voice even. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Croft stepped down from the buggy, a sheaf of papers in his hand. He radiated a triumphant malice. "No pleasure, Mrs. Collins, I assure you, strictly business." He held out the papers. "This is a warrant for the seizure of assets against an unpaid debt held by your late husband." Theda took the papers, her hands steady though her heart had begun to beat a frantic rhythm. She read the legalistic language, her eyes scanning the terms. A loan for 12 head of cattle. Default. Seizure of collateral. Her herd, which had grown to nearly 20 with new calves, was the collateral. It was everything. It was her entire hope for making the farm self-sufficient. "This can't be right," she said, her voice low. All of my husband's debts were settled with the auction. All of the debts against the land, Croft corrected her, savoring the moment. This was a separate agreement, a chattel mortgage, perfectly legal. The debt is past due, and I am here to collect. He gestured to his men. The warrant gives me the authority to seize 12 head of cattle. You can't, she breathed. That would leave me with almost nothing. The calves won't survive without their mothers. That is not my concern, Croft said, his voice cold. Your husband made the deal. You will honor it. Sheriff Beaker shifted uncomfortably. He wouldn't meet her eyes. It's the law, Theta, he mumbled. My hands are tied. Rage, hot and pure, surged through her. This wasn't about a debt. This was about cruelty. It was about Croft proving he could still reach her, still hurt her. He was trying to break her spirit, to drive her out with poverty and shame. She looked at his smug, porcine face, and a cold resolve settled over her. She would not let him. No, she said, her voice ringing with a strength that surprised them all. She stood in the middle of the yard, a lone woman in a faded dress, and planted her feet as if she were taking root in the earth Nate had given back to her. You will not take my animals. Croft laughed, a short, ugly bark. And how do you propose to stop me, Mrs. Collins? Will you call on your protector? I don't see him. It seems you're all alone. The words hit her like a physical blow. He was right. Nate wasn't there. He was miles away, on the far side of his ranch, overseeing the summer branding. He had no idea this was happening. A wave of despair washed over her, so cold and vast it threatened to drown her. For a few glorious weeks, she had felt safe. She had felt the ground solid beneath her feet. Now it was crumbling again. The world was collapsing back into its old, familiar shape of loss and struggle. Croft's men were already moving toward the pasture gate, their ropes at the ready. Sheriff Beaker stood by, a silent, complicit statue. The townspeople who had been passing on the road were stopping, gathering to watch the spectacle. Theta felt their stares, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was the town drama again, the poor widow brought low. The hope she had so carefully nurtured felt like a fool's dream. She could run to the rocking inn, try to find Nate. But it would be too late. By the time she returned, her herd would be gone. She could beg, but she would rather die. Or she could stand her ground. It was hopeless. It was madness. But it was all she had left. She walked to the pasture gate and stood before it, her arms crossed. I told you no, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Croft's face darkened with anger. Sheriff, remove her, he commanded. Sheriff Beaker took a hesitant step toward her. Theta, don't make this harder than it needs to be, he pleaded. She didn't move. She just stared at him, her eyes burning with a righteous fire. She was alone. She was cornered. And she was about to lose everything all over again. The sun beat down on her head, and the world seemed to shrink to this single dusty patch of ground, the site of her last desperate stand. Just as the sheriff reached out to take her arm, a sound tore through the tense silence. It was a high, piercing scream of pure equine fury, followed by the splintering crack of thick timber. Every head snapped toward the rocking inn. The top two rails of Diablo's reinforced corral had exploded outward, and in the opening, the black stallion stood poised for a breathtaking second, a creature of myth, before launching himself into a gallop. Panic erupted. The onlookers scattered, scrambling for the safety of their wagons. Croft's men backed away from the pasture gate, their eyes wide with fear. A loose stallion of Diablo's reputation was more dangerous than a wolf pack. He was a force of nature, a black devil, and he was heading straight for them. But Theta did not run. She stood her ground, her gaze locked on the approaching horse. This was not the wild, terrified animal she had first met. This was the horse she had spent weeks with. the horse whose fear she had soothed, whose trust she had earned. He was not running wild, he was running to her. He thundered into her yard, a maelstrom of power and grace, but as he neared her, he slowed, his hooves dancing on the hard-packed earth. He came to a stop beside her, his massive chest heaving, and nudged her shoulder with his head, a soft guttural nicker rumbling in his chest. In the midst of chaos, he was a picture of perfect devotion and calm. He stood beside her, a silent, formidable guardian, his body a shield between her and the men who threatened her. The crowd was frozen, speechless. Croft's men looked from the horse to the woman and back again, their bravado gone. Sheriff Beaker's jaw hung open. They had all heard the stories of her way with the stallion, but to see it was something else entirely. It was like watching a miracle. She had not tamed him, she had befriended him, and he had come to her aid. It was into this stunned tableau that Nate rode. He must have seen the commotion from a distance, because he came at a hard gallop, his face a thundercloud of concern. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene in an instant. Croft and his fraudulent warrant, the terrified sheriff, his prize stallion standing peacefully beside Theta like a lamb. He understood. He swung down from his horse, his movements economical and dangerous. He ignored Croft completely. He walked past the sheriff as if he weren't there. His only focus was Theta. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching her face, checking for any sign of fear or harm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and tight with a barely controlled fury. "I am now," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She rested a hand on Diablo's powerful neck, the warmth of the horse a steadying comfort. Nate nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin. Then he turned. He walked over to Sheriff Beaker, who flinched as he approached. Without a word, Nate took the warrant from the sheriff's nerveless fingers. He glanced at it, his lip curling in contempt. Then, in front of the entire assembled town, he slowly and deliberately tore the paper in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces fall to the dust. Silas Croft found his voice, sputtering with outrage. "You can't do that. That's a legal document. I'll have the law on you, Nate." Nate turned to face him, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "Your law ends at my fence line, Silas," he said, his voice quiet but carrying with lethal intensity. "And this is my fence line now." He took a step closer, and Croft, for all his bluster, took an involuntary step back. "This farm," Nate announced, his voice rising to carry across the silent yard, "and everything on it, belongs to Mrs. Theta Collins, as will the Rocking N Ranch." He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the shock register on every face. He turned his gaze back to Theta, a look of fierce, protective possession in his eyes. "She has agreed to be my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. Theta's heart stopped. He hadn't asked her. He hadn't even hinted at it. It was a command, a declaration, a move on a chessboard she didn't even know they were playing. It was a public, irrevocable act. He was shielding her with his name, the most powerful weapon he possessed. He was choosing her, not in the quiet of a storm or the intimacy of a shared task, but here, in the dust, in front of everyone. He was tearing down the last wall of his fortress and planting his flag on her land for all the world to see. It was the most terrifying and wonderful thing she had ever heard. Croft stared, his face a mask of disbelief and utter defeat. He had been checkmated. There was no move left for him to make. He climbed back into his buggy, his movements stiff and clumsy, and drove away, a man broken by a power he could not comprehend. The sheriff and Croft's men followed, slinking away like beaten dogs. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, their whispers now filled not with pity, but with a stunned, breathless awe. Theta was left alone in the yard with Nate and the magnificent horse that stood between them. Nate walked back to her, his face uncertain for the first time. The fury was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. He had just gambled his entire world on a woman he had never even courted. I apologize for my presumption," he said, his voice rough. It was the only way I could think to make him stop. Permanently. Theda looked at him, at this powerful, broken man who had just stood against the world for her. She saw the fear in his eyes, not of Croft, but of her. Fear of her rejection, and in that moment she knew her answer. She knew it with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. "It's a funny way to ask a question, Nate," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "But I suppose it'll do." She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "My answer is yes." A month later, they sat on the porch of her farmhouse as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon. The air was cool and smelled of cut hay and contentment. In the pasture below, Diablo grazed peacefully alongside Daisy the mule, an unlikely pair who had found their own kind of peace. The wedding had been a quiet affair, held right here in the yard, with only Lily and a handful of loyal ranch hands as witnesses. The town had been left to its gossip, but the nature of the whispers had changed. They were now tinged with respect and a little fear. No one crossed Nate, and Theda was now, undeniably, his. Lily was thriving. She spent most of her days at the farmhouse, following Theda like a shadow, her laughter now a frequent sound in the quiet rooms. She was learning about herbs from the garden, helping to feed the chickens, and had even, timidly, begun to brush Diablo's glossy coat under Theda's watchful eye. The sadness was receding from the girl's eyes, replaced by the simple, uncomplicated light of childhood. Nate reached over and took Theda's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His touch was no longer hesitant or fleeting. It was sure and warm, and it felt like coming home. "I never properly asked you," he said, his voice a low murmur in the twilight. He turned to face her, his winter sky eyes searching hers. "Not in a way a woman deserves to be asked. You tore up a legal document and declared me your fiancé in front of a mob," she teased gently. It was quite memorable. A rare, small smile touched his lips. "I was afraid," he admitted, and the confession was a gift. "I've been afraid for a long time. When Sarah died, I closed a door. I didn't think I'd ever open it again. I didn't think I wanted to." He looked out at the darkening land, at the empire he had built with his own 2 hands. "This was all I had. This work. This land. It was enough. Until you." He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "You walked into that corral, and you weren't afraid of the monster. You saw the horse. You did the same for me, Theda. You walked right past the walls I'd built and saw the man inside. You saved me as surely as I saved this farm for you." Tears welled in her eyes, warm and cleansing. This was the truth of it, the mutual rescue. He had pulled her from the depths of poverty, and she had pulled him from the prison of his grief. He had given her a home, and she had given him a reason to live in it. "Theda Collins," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Will you be my wife? Will you help me make this place a home for our daughter? For us?" "I already am your wife, Nate," she whispered, her heart full to bursting. "And this is already our home." He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that held all the promises of the future. It was a kiss that tasted of second chances and hard-won peace. The frontier was still wild. The world still held its dangers. But here, on this porch, with his hand in hers and the quiet sounds of their life settling around them, Theda had found her shelter. The woman who had arrived with nothing now had everything that mattered. She belonged, and she was loved.